Okay, so I recognize a lot of faces here, but some of you I don't know, so I will introduce myself. My name is Isabel Tabi, and I teach art history and aesthetic theory in the Visual and Critical Studies program here at SVA. And tonight I'm very pleased to introduce Cara Starke, who is the Director of Exhibitions at Creative Time. She is the third speaker in this spring's Art in the First Person series, sponsored by the BFA Visual and Critical Studies program. The final speaker of this spring semester will be Saeed Ali Naqvi, who will give a talk on the artist Sada Kane on Monday, April 6th. So that's something to look forward to next month. So I invited Cara to come and speak to us this evening because we've had presentations by quite a number of artists and art historians, but only by a handful of curators, and in particular, very few who are involved with nonprofit organizations such as Creative Time, which commissions and presents public art projects, and I'm now quoting from their website, throughout New York City, across the world, across the country, and now even in outer space. So we'll have to maybe hear a little bit more about that. I think that Cara will offer all of us her unique perspective on the challenges of organizing public art events. And she mentioned to me before that she very much would welcome any kind of dialogue or question even as she's talking, and she'll probably say more about that after she comes up. A little bit of a background information on Cara. Cara Starke joined Creative Time as the Director of Exhibitions in 2011. Previously, she was Assistant Curator in the Department of Media and Performance Art at the Museum of Modern Art, where she co-organized several exhibitions, including the Francis Alice A Story of Deception in 2011, Projects 93, Dean Q. Lay in 2010, and the William Kentridge 5 Themes in 2010, and collaborated on Pippoliti Rist, Pour Your Body Out, which was in 2008, Take Your Time, Olafur Eliasson, also in 2008, Doug Atkin, Sleepwalkers, and Douglas Gordon, Timeline. She received her MA in art history from Williams College and her BA from Cornell University. She currently is putting the finishing touches on an exhibition that will take place in Central Park titled Drifting in Daylight, Art in Central Park, and that is scheduled to open on May 15th. So something else to look forward to. I assume you'll maybe address that today as well. Now, please help me in welcoming Cara.
Hello, thanks all for coming. I'm Cara Starke. It's great to be here. As Isabel said, feel free, if you've got questions, I'm open, so you can always feel free to ask, and we'll certainly do some Q&A at the end. So, Creative Time. It's actually been around for 40 years. I don't know how well versed you are in the history, but I was asked to share a bit of the trajectory of the organization. Founded in 1973, and basically there's two fundamental convictions of the organization that we follow. One, we believe artists matter, that they have a really important voice in our society today. And two, we believe that we have the opportunity to provide artists with spaces for bold experimentation, especially in the public realm, which is where we work. Creative Time, as I said, was founded in 1973. The nation was at war. There was a social climate that was changing. It was amidst the distrust of the government, which of course continues to this day, Watergate, Arab oil embargo. And the city was a really different place than we see now. This is an image of the subways covered in graffiti. And the city was also awash in unused spaces. So while certainly you see the decay of a city, was also a moment for artists to take hold of that and to take advantage of unused spaces throughout the city. There was basically a can-do feeling in the air, and it was something that Creative Time began to work with artists to activate these spaces. So here, this is an image from Art on the Beach, which took place in Lower Manhattan in 1978 to 1985. It's now Battery Park City, but this is actually landfill that was beach. And it was activated by a series of performances, musicians, and all sorts of artists basically creating temporary works in that space. The organization also started commissioning artists. This is Grand Fury's 1989, Kissing Doesn't Kill, Greed and Indifference Do. And this was on buses all throughout the city. Certainly an iconic image. For me, maybe some of you have seen it in textbooks, but it was basically mimicking the form of Benetton ads that were happening at that time and trying to really address larger social issues, especially amidst the AIDS crisis in this city. There's certainly a certain politics to the history of the organization and to where we're at this moment. This is Freedom of Expression National Monument, where basically the public was invited to come up and speak their voice to the public. It was actually restaged again in 2004 in Foley Square, where the public could actually speak out to City Hall. At the same time, there was, in the 80s, the Brooklyn Bridge anchorage. This is actually inside the bridge. You can't go in there anymore after 9/11. But Creative Time started to activate these neglected spaces. So it had been storage, and then it turned into a space for live performances, events. The first skateboard half-pipe within the vicinity of the city was actually created by an artist in that space. So it was a regular convening space. And then in the late 90s, really started to move away from the temporary group exhibitions into single artist commissions and realizing what we sort of thought of as dream projects. So this is Chris Doyle's Leap. It's a projection of 420 New Yorkers jumping up in the air, and it was projected on the side of the building that's actually the Museum of Art and Design now. So a nighttime piece. And then in 2001, Vic Muniz created this piece. Now Vic, like a lot of the artists that we work with, he said he wasn't a public artist. He had no idea what he could do in the public realm. This was not his area, and that we find pretty typical. It's very, very hard to present artists with the sort of limitlessness of the public realm. What do you have? I mean, there's so much to respond to. It's really very different than working in a gallery space. And we can talk about that if you'd like. So Vic one day wrote down a drawing of a cloud and said, I'd like to do this. I'd like to do this in skywriting. And so that's what Creative Time did. So in fact, there were a lot of people who actually saw it that day, and of course it lasts in these photographs as well. But he has cited that it really was heavily influential for him in his practice, and you can see now in his work, he's certainly engaging in the public in a much more different way with his own practice. In 2002, Creative Time became known for perhaps its most iconic work, the Tribute in Light. This work has been repeated annually, but not by Creative Time, but the very first commission was in fact a Creative Time commission. And while perhaps not incredibly obvious at this moment, it was in fact a very bold thing 6 months after the World Trade Center attack to actually create an artwork. Not just about it, but actually at the site. So while it's gone on to receive a lot of acclaim and also people who don't like it, it was certainly something that connects very much to those convictions that I mentioned in the beginning, that the public space is a space for dialogue, for activation, and for artists to be inserting themselves into the conversations of our times. This is a rendering of a piece that actually happened just a little while after that by Sai-Kuo Chung. So this was, and I'll show you the actual piece right here. This was a halo of fireworks that was supposed to take place over Central Park. It was in 2003 to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the park. And as you'll see, sometimes you can create a rendering, but when you actually work in the public realm and you only do something once, as in the case of this work, you don't necessarily know what's going to happen. And this was an example where what was anticipated didn't exactly happen. First of all, nobody had set off this many fireworks in one place at one time. This was only 2 years after 9/11. And there was a hurricane happening. So in fact, there was a lot of people heard a lot of noise, didn't know what was happening. Half the fireworks didn't quite explode at the same time. It was it was not exactly what had been imagined or anticipated. When you ask Anne, who was the director at the time, though, she would say, I would absolutely do it again, even though it didn't work the way they thought, because the reality was they took a risk. They went for something, and she was very proud of being able to take that opportunity, and something that still follows us. We look to take risks in public space, to get people talking and conversing, and it's very hard to know how things are going to turn out, and they never happen the way you actually imagine. This is a piece by Jenny Holzer. Abuse of power comes as no surprise. These were a number of her truisms that were actually placed around the city via light projection. This one was flown over the city in an airplane. And then in 2007, there was a piece that was actually in collaboration with the Museum of Modern Art. So in my own personal history, this is where I sort of came into Creative Times dialogue. This was the Doug Aiken project. It started because Doug wanted to activate Midtown in particular, and the architecture. What would happen if the architecture could communicate, could speak, the people behind those walls? And he ended up creating a film that was actually broken into 7 pieces, that was filmed all over the city, but then projected onto the facade of MoMA at night. I've got a few more images for you. And I, at the time, was working at at MoMA, so I was working on this exhibition from the other end. And this is a great image. You'll see actually the reflections down here. That's because it's raining at that time. And a lot of people asked, well, why would we do this major commission of this artist for January? The day it opened was like it was like this past winter. I mean, it was absurdly cold. And it was a very simple answer. You can't actually project through trees, through leaves. And so you actually have to wait until you can actually mount your projectors in such a way, and the garden is filled with leaves. And so again, working in public space, there's so many different things that one is considering. When we were actually installing this piece, we had all of our projectors up, we had them calibrated, and they had their like the grid pattern at the beginning. And suddenly we looked, and there was this image that one of the neighbors across the street had taken her home video projector and was shooting it across the street onto our artwork as a little bit of a joke. And I mean, it was pretty hilarious, and at the end of the day, had she actually shot it when we had our live images, you wouldn't really be able to see her image because of the brightness and quality of our own. But the sort of unanticipated nature of what you deal with in public space. In this case, actually dealing with private space, what you'll notice is that the museum is in fact very dark. That's because all several hundred people who are behind those windows had to work in darkness. Once this started, we went through and every single person had to pull down their blinds and turn down their lights, because when you project onto glass, you need it to be dark on the other side for the image to actually hold. So MoMA had a nightly routine of everyone who was close to any window having to pull down their curtains and turn down their lights. That's a controlled environment, whereas when your neighbor starts projecting on top of your artwork, not as controlled. This is Paul Chan waiting for Godot in New Orleans. When Paul went down to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, he said that it reminded him of Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot. There was a sense of waiting. It was incredible amount of pasture. What you see here is in the lower 9th Ward. Behind these 3 men they're from the Classical Theater of Harlem, is the wall where the levee broke. And this was a community. There were homes. This is now 2 years after Hurricane Katrina, and the homes were not rebuilt. In fact, there was so much complication in the bureaucracy that people basically they couldn't even identify their own plots of land. They couldn't, the rebuild certainly was not happening in this lower 9th Ward. It was one of the poorest neighborhoods and most devastated by the storm. So Paul came to Creative Time or had been in dialogue with Creative Time and wanted to realize a production of Waiting for Godot that would be for the community. And I should mention that all of the projects we do are free and they're meant to be open and available to everyone. So Paul didn't just stage Waiting for Godot, but he actually went down there and he lived there for a long period of time. He taught at universities and Creative Time too. In fact, several of the staff members went down there for significant periods of time because of what the organization realized is to really have an ethical practice where you're engaging in space. It's very difficult to do that if you're not actually able to be in dialogue with community, and especially in a place like New Orleans where a lot of the conversation, a lot of the work happens, over dinner at someone's home, through these connections. You can't do that all via phone and email. You have to have personal connections. So it's been one of the struggles in terms of working nationally, internationally. It was less of a struggle working to outer space because you can just send something up there. So Waiting for Godot. This is an image from the play. People said he'd be lucky if 20 people showed up. It was 2 weekends, 3 nights each, I believe, and there were hundreds, I believe there were 800 seats, but people were literally out there waiting, tailgating for a Beckett play. I mean, it was extraordinary. I had the privilege of going down there. I wasn't yet working for the organization, but I did have the privilege of watching it, and it was an incredibly powerful experience. And so what you see here is the same scene, but the levee is lit up, and this is his theater set, which takes place under a tree. That's Wendell Pierce, if you recognize him from The Wire. So one of the things, though, of working in public space is you get a lot of input from the community where you're working, and one of the things that was said was, everybody knows the lower ninth. That's what's getting on the national news everywhere, but people aren't talking about all the other communities that were affected. So it was staged in the lower ninth ward the first weekend, and then the second weekend was actually in a community named Gentilly. And so this is, in fact, the second staging, which is in a home that literally was being rebuilt by the day. So they would show up for their production, and it was actually an active construction site at the same time. Probably not the safest conditions, but it really spoke to what was happening in that community, and you really see the audience actually out for that one. In 2008, there was a piece by David Byrne. This was in the Battery Maritime building. It was called Playing the Building, and it was essentially the public was invited to activate the space via this organ, which was hooked up, and these are there's actually air that blows through and caused little hammers to tap on the building, pipes to blow, and so by playing the organ, you could actually really truly activate the space. It was also an opportunity to work with an artist and really expand how they're viewed in the public light, and an artist like David Byrne, known for his music, not always known for his visual practice, and an opportunity to get into an extraordinary space in the city. Battery Maritime, this beautiful place. I believe, I haven't kept up on it, but I think it's slated to become luxury hotels and condos still, possibly even worked on it. But it was a real opportunity to open up a space like that and allow the public to come in. This was part of a project by the artist Jeremy Deller, phenomenal artist. It was a car that was, it was destroyed in a bombing in Baghdad, and then he took this car on the road with a Iraqi citizen and a former former American military man who were inviting the public into dialogue. It was called It Is What It Is, and this bombed out car traveled around the country. So another way of working in a national sphere, and conversations literally took place along the road. They would pull up, they would set up their tent, and they would invite people into public dialogue. And the artist was with them as well at that time. In 2010, Paul Ramirez-Jonas produced A Key to the City. It was this way of activating a lot of spaces through 25 sites throughout the 5 boroughs. What you're looking down on is Times Square. And what the project was premised on was an exchange of a key, which for the 1 month of the project became actually New York City's literal key to the city. It was endorsed by Bloomberg for that 1 month as the key to the city. And these keys opened up spaces throughout the city. Some were private spaces that you wouldn't have been able to get access to. Some actually were public spaces that, like there was a door on the GW Bridge, which didn't actually change anything, but it was a way of getting people aware of their own city, what they own, what they don't own, what's private, how do people negotiate space. And a lot happened that emerged from it. He was very interested in this being not just you received your key, but actually it was an exchange. So if you came with someone, you actually would bestow the key on the other person you're with, or somebody else on the line if you came by yourself. And so it was a shared process, and a lot of things happened. There was a lamppost that you could kind of get access to the bottom of that people started to exchange notes in. It became like a very public process as part of it, in addition to shedding light on how we negotiate our way through the city. And more recently, Immigrant Movement International, which is an ongoing project. Creative Time was involved in the first year of it. This is a piece by Tanya Bruguera. She originally came to Creative Time with the idea of creating a political party for immigrants. But of course, creating a political party is exactly what a nonprofit cannot do. Yeah, I mean, it's actually illegal for nonprofits to do that. So the next best thing was to create this this project that has lasted, and she is actually working on her political party separately. But it was an opportunity to work on a project and work with local immigrant communities. This was a physical space based in Queens, and it became a social gathering space, a space for dialogue. There were legal counsel brought in, there were English lessons, there were art classes. It became not just a community center, but a real resource within the community. And Tanya actually lived above it, and was really very active in its life. It's actually continued on. We partnered with the Queens Museum, and they continued to work on the project. But really, Tanya embodied a lot of things that the artists that we love to work with do. She said she doesn't want to create art that points to an issue. She wants to create art that participates in the issue. And I think that comment has been one that's inspired us as an organization and speaks to a lot of the work that we do. So this was at the end of the 1 year. She staged a protest that was part of a rally that was happening at City Hall at the same time. More recently, I don't know if any of you have seen, now we're getting into like the last few years, so hopefully you'll have maybe some more points of connection. And again, as we get into these projects, feel free to chime in if there's certain aspects you want to learn about. But this, you're looking at the Park Avenue Armory. Amazing, amazing space in the city. If you haven't been, it's worth going to anything they do there. It's always pretty phenomenal, just the space alone. We invited the artist Tom Sachs to create his Mission to Mars, where basically Tom Sachs is known for hand making all of these extraordinary works, and he basically recreated Mars in the Park Avenue Armory. He would actually say it was Mars, not just a recreation. But his team essentially lived there, they ate there, they slept there, they worked out there, they analyzed systems, they actually excavated into the floor of Mars and found life on Mars. And it became not just a sculptural installation, but an active performance that was happening throughout the entirety of the show. And Isabel mentioned that we sent an artwork into outer space. This was the first project I worked on at Creative Time. When I arrived in 2011, my first thing I had to do was figure out how to get an artwork into outer space. It's perhaps why I love what I do. I like the challenge. I like that I've never have never delved into the subject and will probably never get to use it again. But during that time, we worked with the artist Trevor Paglin, and he had a piece called The Last Pictures. And it was a series of 100 images. You can find all of them, and there's a great book of them, but you can also find them online. And he was interested in the fact that long after the Earth gets swallowed by the sun, the things that will remain in outer space will be the Earth's longest living artifacts. So what he wanted to do was create an artwork that was going to outlive us all. And so what we did is we actually he worked at MIT in working on materials so that we were able to fabricate this extraordinary disc, which actually got attached to a satellite that got launched into this geosynchronous orbit. So the geosynchronous orbit is the place where all of your cell phone towers, your satellite, or television satellites, and also all of the spy technology is located, because it's just at the right distance away from the Earth that it always remains constant in terms of its location. So it can always point to the same location. So we were able to attach to a television satellite that was going up, which was very lucky, truthfully. Organizationally, we could have never afforded to send something into outer space. You actually have to find people who fall in love with your projects that make it a reality. And miracle of miracles, one day our director was giving a talk, and she, at the end of it, just happened to mention, or not maybe deliberately mentioned, if anybody knew anybody who was connected to anyone working in outer space, let her know. And one guy was like, yeah, my cousin, his father founded EchoStar, which is basically Dish Network. So, and that guy fell in love with the project, and they, early on, I was talking to scientists, and they didn't really take us that seriously. I don't think they recognized that we were like so game on. They were like, okay, well, in 8 weeks, you have to have the whole thing fabricated and ready, because it has to undergo a year of testing to get onto the satellite. We're like, okay, 8 weeks, we're doing this. And within 8 weeks, they had it delivered, and they're like, oh, okay, now we have to figure out how we're going to attach this to our satellite. Anyway, that was launched in 2012, EchoStar 16, and it's going to remain out there. It will be probably Creative Time's longest lasting project. So this is an image of the silicone disc on which those images are embedded. And this is an image of the other side of the disc. This is a star chart. There was a lot of conversation, obviously, in terms of what images he was going to choose, what images to communicate. There's a very important historic work that, if you're thinking about this piece, you should know about, in terms of Carl Sagan's golden record that went into outer space as well. And this is a star chart because it's actually very hard to communicate time. You know, you can't just write down 2015 and expect that whoever finds this, whatever finds this object is going to know. So in fact, time becomes about positioning of stars and placement, and that becomes a mechanism for measuring time. So that is the measurement system that he used to indicate the date of the piece. A lot of amazing conversations that went into that. So about a couple months later, we partnered with MTA Arts for Transit and realized this performance in Grand Central. It was actually the third time Creative Times worked in Grand Central. Takashi Murakami, and I'm blanking on the other one. Anyway, Nick Caves. This was a series of performances. We partnered with the Alvin Ailey School, and his amazing sound suits got activated every day with these extraordinary performances in this space. This is Vanderbilt Hall. We're very lucky to be able to work there. Going to Grand Central every day, you know, one of the special things about working in a place like Creative Time is that your gallery space becomes wherever you're working. You get to know these places in ways you had no idea before. So, so even just watching the publics that come in there, but certainly the public did seem to fall in love with this piece. We had no idea how incredibly popular it would be, and people literally would come and camp out for it, because there's limited space too. It was very fixed, and there was like this whole long line of strollers. We had to create a whole little child section. Anyway, we learned to be responsive to the conditions you're in. This is a set of images from before, from the rehearsal. We had these, like I said, Alvin Ailey's students we were working with who were phenomenal. So they actually they were rehearsing in the space, and then the whole piece is in his incredible sound studios, which are handmade, and they have a noise to them, like a very, like a swishing fabric, almost taffeta-like noise to them. So I hear a lot of you recently spoke about this piece. This is Suzanne Lacey's Between the Door and the Street. So again, if you want to hear about certain aspects of it, by all means, chime in. But for those of you who aren't as familiar, I'll start off with a little bit about the piece. Suzanne Lacey is an incredible artist, one that I think a lot of us have admired for a long time. She wanted to do a piece that spoke to important issues related to women. And what does it mean to be a feminist today? Is feminist even a term that we should be using? And she ended up working, her process is one of organizing, community organizing. I learned a huge amount from her, and it's something that's informed our practice ever since. But the organization has for some time been very interested in how community organizing dovetails with the practice of public art. So she wound up connecting to over 400 women and men who were in dialogue on a street in Brooklyn. We actually, so our organization got permission from all of the homeowners of this one particular block in Brooklyn. But to even get to that block, just so you understand the logistics of what we do, I sent a team of people out on bicycles through Brooklyn. She had a vision for a block that had incredible stoops. So, and sort of these, iconic Brooklyn stoops, right? But the reality is that there's only a few of those that have full blocks of them. They couldn't be interrupted by apartment buildings. So I had people out on bicycles, and then we realized there were actually only 3 that kind of met her needs and the locations she was interested in working in. And so we targeted one, Park Place, and what emerged was actually an incredible community of people who were very supportive of the arts, very active on their own block, and we became part of the fabric of their neighborhood. Things that did not happen as publicly, but that were happening behind the scenes, we were doing potlucks with the community. We connected with over 80 organizations, and those were the people who brought in all of the people who were in dialogue on that day, and we were doing a lot of advanced communication with them, finding out what do they want to talk about. These were unscripted dialogues. They were opportunities for people to have conversations and to have them publicly. There are downsides of having 400-something people in conversation on one block. It can be hard to hear. And so there were a lot of logistical things that we learned in the process. It's kind of like mini theater, but when you don't want to put people on the stage, quite literally, how do you create it in such an environment that's both open to the public without becoming overly theatrical? So it was a very overt decision not to mic people, not to amp it, but one that was limiting for some people, but also you see other people kind of got real close and really into the dialogues, usually not breaking that fourth wall, if you will, but after the performance, the dialogue portion of the performance ended, and they went through 3 different conversations during their time. They themselves determined the conversations they wanted to have, but there were sort of guidelines that in terms of the timing, and the artist was watching from above and really like a director making sure, okay, the conversation's going to switch at this moment. So after the conclusion of it, all of the speakers and the public were invited into the middle of the block where we hosted everyone with, I think it was apple cider and donuts. It was fall. It was really quite beautiful, I have to say, when we were out on the block. Other logistical things you never think about, like how to clear a whole block of cars. And we had done that, and we were literally sweeping the streets, cleaning up all the leaves, cleaning up all the debris. And there were 2 B&Bs on that block that we were actually, Suzanne would stay in all the time. And out comes this couple who were in their wedding outfits. And so they were like, oh my goodness, they came out into the middle of the block, they got to take these photos. We had done a lot of subtle touches that were meant to just highlight what people were seeing without being really overt. So there were yellow flowers on each house, and you can almost see the yellow strip right up here, right? So it was both deliberate in terms of installation. How do we create something that sort of signals this is the performance space, actually acts as a public safety, making sure that when you bring thousands of people in the block that they're not going to be tripping over those corners, and also just really extending what you might already see, right? We weren't contributing too much visually to it, but like you already have the bright yellow of the sidewalk edge and the yellow flowers of fall, and then of course the yellow scarves that they wore was how she tied them together. So these were some of the women in dialogue, and it's been really interesting. A lot of the women actually continue to, or organizations continue to connect. A lot of people are trying to find ways of how do you create a project that sustains beyond you, which is tough for an organization like ours. We are fairly small and we do about 2 main projects a year. I should have said this up front, but we do 2 or 3 major commissions a year. And while we continue our connections and our organization builds upon them and the relationships we make, it's very hard to kind of keep maintaining. We have to keep moving forward in order to be able to realize the next artist project. So we often try to set things up so that our partners, and everywhere we go, we do partner, that our partners have the opportunity to continue the dialogue. So more recently, did all of you see the show, Kara Walker, Dominos Sugar Factory? Maybe? None of you saw it? Okay. A few of you saw it? Maybe you saw it in the papers? Yeah? Okay. This was really special opportunity. This project took about a year to come together. The reality of our projects is that we'd love a long, long period of time to realize artist dreams, and sometimes that's the case. Right now I've got several projects in sort of the hopper, if you will, that have a long time of sustaining. Other projects happen more quickly. This was one where our board chair, Jed Walenzis, who is part of the family that is 2 trees that and I say this very, very overtly. So our board chair bought the property of Domino and invited Creative Time in, actually to realize potentially our gala. And I went along and I was like, this is amazing. This is such a special place. And we realized we wanted to commission a work in there, and he was extremely open to it. When we first went in, I have to say, it was inches thick of molasses on the ground. Nobody had been in there before in a long, long time. And not since it was in active use. And there were pigeons that remained actually throughout the entirety of the show. So we invited Cara in. She was one of those artists. When I said Vic Muniz said, I'm not a public artist, I wouldn't know what to do. She was an artist that Creative Time had been in dialogue with for a long time. And she had said the same thing. My work isn't, her work has a lot of difficult content in there, and it's not always meant for broad publics, and she does it within the confines of a gallery and museum. So she wasn't sure how she wanted to work with Creative Time but didn't know how. And we said, you know what, we've got this extraordinary space, come see it. So she came in the next morning. We received, I think it was about 20 drawings that she had made all night. They were phenomenal. They were nothing even close to what you saw, but you could just see she was so inspired by the place. If you went there, if you did make it to the exhibition, you might remember the smell of that sugar. That's not something that was our contribution or the contribution of her artwork. That was because that place was in active use as a sugar refinery for 100 years. It had that smell embedded in it. It was just covered and coated in sugar. If you looked up into the rafters, it was there was sugar everywhere, and that was something that she was. See, there were a lot of initial parts of that project that she latched onto and hooked onto, and what we ended up doing, we gave her the summer to move through her ideas, and by the end of the summer, she had created what we refer to as the Sphinx. It actually did start as a model of the Egyptian Sphinx and turned into this woman, but we sort of still maintain the same terminology, which I found very interesting, that it was adapted so easily into press and people's communication, and everyone referred to it as the Sphinx. This is a sculpture that was built on site. It had to be taken apart afterwards as well. But essentially, it's built out of a foam core structure that's covered in 35 tons of sugar. We were very lucky, actually. Domino's came on board. They were incredibly progressive, I thought, and very generous in donating sugar to us. At the same time, we also built these sculptural pieces. These were modeled on these small dolls that she had found for sale online. I think they're meant to be purchased and put on your bookcase. I'm not totally sure. They come from a history of racist memorabilia, really. And she was particularly drawn to these young children. They're big eyes, but they're working in the fields, and she blew them up to sort of quasi life-size scale. And her original vision was to make them out of sugar too. Whereas the Sphinx has that foam armature, and we were able to go and actually, the way that was built was actually, we had these like cement mixers of sugar and water that we were literally dumping and like scrubbing onto the body. And when I say we, I literally mean the entire Creative Time team was in rubber suits and like scrubbing down the Sphinx with sugar. These were actually also these sugar sculptures, these the boys holding the bananas, were built on site as well. There is, behind this boy, there were these like lifted areas, these decks, and if any of you have seen Breaking Bad, maybe, we basically had our own iteration of a meth lab. Basically, we had our sugar lab with these guys in these sort of white onesie hazmat suits dealing with hot sugar, and we essentially made the world's largest lollipops, which nobody had ever made before. And you'll see in this image, this one here is fully made of sugar, and it actually does, you can see a little bit here, it did have a metal armature. And that one over there is actually made out of resin, and it was coated in sugar every week. We'd pour it. And the reason for that is we built these lollipops, for lack of a better word, and it's really hard to know what's going to happen when no one's ever done anything. So they did start to melt. So before the show opened, 2 of them actually had fallen, and she actually took their remains the morning of the show opening. She actually took their remains and distributed them in the baskets of their brothers, the resin boys. So a dark piece turned even darker, and actually what we discovered is that they melted from the inside, which was also, it was very powerful. They, like a sort of Tootsie Pop, like they have a soft inside. So their outer shell remained hard, and they would sort of melt from the inside and fold over from the belly. So as the exhibition went along, we just let them melt in place. So we had some that were the resin, so people who came to the exhibition later, she wanted a certain number of them overall. So there were some that were resin, and then the ones that were in sugar as well that progressed over time. And like I said, we like to take challenges. No one had ever done this. When she came to us, even like we went to confectioners and all sorts of sugar people when we told them about the sculpture, and they were like, no, that's not happening. And we're like, oh no, it's going to happen. We just need to figure out how it's going to happen. So that's a nice long shot of the interior when it was empty, but of course then when it was full as well. Prompted a lot of conversation. I know you guys spoke about this piece as well. There were a number of amazing things that happened in that space. One is there was an event called We Are Here. It was a call to people of color to come and have ownership of the space and basically to be present. So it was quite extraordinary. It was an amazing day. In fact, most days were truly amazing there. But they also, and we worked very closely with We Are Here to make sure that it would run smoothly and that everything they wanted to do. It wasn't about creating some particular performance in the space. It was literally about activating the space and being present. And they did do outside the space, though, a sort of series of conversations and like a response board, which we totally endorsed as well. But there was also a lot of conversation around images and selfies and Twitter, and I imagine when you guys were talking, you might have gotten into that as well, because a lot of people experienced this project through not just seeing the art, but actually online as well. We hoped it would be an amazing attendance. We had no idea what we were in for. We had about 150,000 people in 9 weekends. Our last 2 weekends had 10,000 people a day. I mean, I have a tiny team. This was built out. We had over 100 and something volunteers on this show. Those were all the people who were greeting you, who were speaking to you. When I said that Suzanne Lacey and her practice of hiring community organizing influenced us, we actually did hire an organizer that worked on this show as well. And while you may not directly see how it influenced the work, in fact, it had great influence. We worked in the community, we got to know people. One of the volunteers was named Robert Sheldon. He actually worked in the factory. And he came and volunteered for us every Saturday and spoke about his experience. Actually, he became a cover article in the New York Times, which was pretty incredible if you want to read about him. So the work that we were doing behind the scenes occasionally also becomes visible to the public, but it's the process that we go through. This is the project that followed, was in partnership with the Weeksville Heritage Center, an extraordinary space that exists in Brooklyn. Weeksville is one of the original first Black communities in New York. Basically, in order to have the right to vote, you had to be male and you had to own property. And this very bright man named James Weeks bought a very large piece of property and created an intentional community and basically sold off plots so that he could create a community of land owning. Like a free Black community that had the opportunity to vote as well. So we were very much influenced by this site as a site of self-determination and commissioned 4 different installations that were both in the site as well as in the local community. Zena Bailey created an installation that was working within one of the houses and basically working with the Boys and Girls High School to fashion furniture and design in an attempt at self-determination and creating a space of recycled and owned material. Bradford Young worked with a local church to tell a story of African diaspora, and it was installed at this extraordinary school that was, again, in this abandoned spot that we had a fleeting opportunity to populate. Otabenga Jones and Associates created a temporary radio station out of the back half of a pink Cadillac. If you ever want to create an artwork with half a car, I have a lot of advice for you. Do the full car. It's much better to be able to drive that thing around than tow it. And then Symone Lee created the Free People's Medical Clinic. It was at the home of one of the first female Black doctors in the country. She was an OBGYN. She served a lot of the community. And Symone was very interested in what healthcare, especially dignified healthcare, could look like today. What she realized is that she couldn't herself truly become a space of healthcare, but that she was able to speak towards what it would look like to inch towards this. So she created a lot of free services that were available, from blood pressure to yoga and massage. And basically the community could come and take classes, see a doctor, speak to nurses on call. It was a beautiful installation. one that saw a lot of active use as well. And as part of it, we created a series of public programs, anything from food programs to dialogue to the entire church coming out for Bradford's film screening in the upper right-hand corner, where I think it was the first time a Creative Time Commission has received a blessing. So that was a really beautiful moment, but a lot of community work was going into it and resulting in an extraordinary process, which leads us to where we're headed now. We are about to go into Central Park. I feel incredibly lucky. This is, when I talk about the different gallery spaces I have around the city, I mean, Central Park, wow. When we first started this project, here's Central Park. When we first started it, my co-curator and I were like, we are gonna tackle the whole park. Well, you know what, that park is really big, really big. We realized that would be a 12-hour exhibition, and we didn't think that was gonna work. So we walked around the park and we became really interested in the north end of the park. If any of you know about Olmsted and Vox, the designers of the park, really, really extraordinary, rich history. And the park Olmsted called the park a work of landscape art. And the realities of actually working there and being sensitive both to his vision and the extraordinary amount of attendance and sensitivities to our partner, the Parks Department, was very real. So it's resulted in a project that's heavily performance-based, that's very temporary, very light touches, things that are responsive to the landscape and that take inspiration in how we actually engage with civic spaces like parks, that how do we actually activate these spaces and how do they come to be. So we're focusing above the reservoir, so on the top quarter or third of the park. And we'll have 8 artist commissions. Only a couple of them have been announced, so I only chose a few to talk about because I honestly couldn't remember which have been shared publicly or not. So this piece is Ragnar Kjartansson's SS Hangover. The north end of the park. How many of you guys have actually been? North End? Oh, all of you? Awesome. All right, almost all of you? Okay, because I've asked this question to people and I couldn't believe how many people had not actually been to the North End. But it's a very different feel up there. But actually, in terms of its audience numbers, it gets really different numbers and you sort of feel that rawness that was part of the original vision. When you walk around the middle or the South End, there's a lot of like low barriers preventing you from going onto the grass, et cetera. But in the North End, it's still pretty open. A lot of the landscape from the South End also exists in the North End, but in a different way. So like the Ramble exists as the North Woods, the boating pond equates with the Harlem Mere. So he repeated a lot of the motifs. I should also just mention that Central Park is a completely man-made, or not completely, a mostly man-made environment. The only thing that exists are these rocky outcroppings are original, but everything else is truly a created community. It was actually one of New York's, it's really one of the first examples of eminent domain because in fact there were people living in that area of the city before the park was created. But a beautiful thing that they did do, and it was really intended as a park for the people and Adirondacks for the everyday person. So taking that to heart, this is a piece by Ragnar Kjartansson. It was actually installed as part of the last Venice Biennial. And it's a series of 6 musicians and a boat captain. This is actually a rendering. I hesitate ever from showing renderings, but when you saw that Saiko Chung one, you know why. But I felt pretty comfortable with sticking a boat in the water of the Mere for you to get a sense of it. But the musicians are playing this one incredibly beautiful melodic dark piece over and over, and they'll be going in a loop around this very small island that's in the Harlem Mere. They'll be the only boat up in the lake, whereas in the boating lake down below there's obviously tons. Spencer Finch is going to be creating a piece called Sunset Central Park. Actually on Wednesday he's going to go paint the sunset from the roof of the Met. And then he will take his painting and he's going to translate it into ice cream colors. And we are literally, I just purchased an ice cream truck last week. And we are going to turn it into a solar-powered ice cream truck. And so the power of the sun will be driving the energy of the soft serve machine and serving free ice cream in the colors of a Central Park sunset. And here's another example. Like I said, there's 8 commissions. I only threw in slides for 3. But this is going to be a piece by David Levine called Private Moment, where he will be reinserting into the landscape of Central Park film scenes from iconic movies that were filmed in Central Park, and he'll be replacing them into their original locations. This was a piece where he and I have spoken at great length because I worried that people would suddenly think that they could see their favorite movie over and over. And the reality is what he's doing, which I think is brilliant, is he's actually, these are very subtle things that will happen in the landscape, and they will be on sort of loops, if you will. Everything in the show has to be happening during the entire hours of our show, so it's not just one performance, but it'll be continuing. And it reminds us that the park, in fact, is this this performative space, that it is a cinematic experience as we walk through it, and that couple breaking up might be Royal and Ethel Tenenbaum, or maybe just another couple that lives in this city, but that's the reality of the city that we're living in the shared space of our city as well. So different ways. These are very heavily performative pieces, and a lot of them are, as I said, but different responses, both from the physical landscape to the histories to how the park is activated now. So wow, perfect timing. So that's the end of my actual presentation, but I hope there are questions or things you guys want to talk about, or yeah, go ahead. Okay, well, I will try to answer that as concisely as possible, and you let me know if you want to know more. But basically, every project we do is new. You're always trying to figure it out. You're always trying to realize new work. It's part of what drives us. But yes, it is also, when I made that transition from MoMA to Creative Time, everyone was like, how can you possibly go from a place where everything was inside to outside? I said, it's all about relationship building. You have to build your relationships on the inside of an institution, and ours is working within the public space. And when we do that, we try to go in sensitively and with intention. So there is a lot of conversation, a lot of relationship building that goes into it. And when you have no walls, you actually have to rely on both those relationships, but also your reputation. If I did anything on any project that undermined somebody in the past, that's going to only come to haunt me. And so we work really, really hard to maintain our relationships and make sure we're incredible collaborators and partners. And it may seem sort of silly or light, but like that is the fundamental thing to us, and that's not, I don't take that lightly at all. Really making sure that you've got partners and are keeping that communication and everyone in the loop, in the know, on board is really important as part of the process. An example to what you were sort of talking about, well, 2 examples. Nick Cave, doing that in Grand Central. Turns out we were partnering with MTA Arts for Transit, but that space was actually owned, it's the building of Grand Central, but operated by Metro North. I mean, when I got into a room with these guys, it was like a whole bureaucracy. I just let them converse until, I could come in the end and try to listen to what everyone was saying and bring them all together. Similarly, I have a project that hasn't been announced part of Central Park, but it has to do with the lampposts in the North End. And when I presented it to the Parks Department and Central Park Conservancy, who are our partners, and they're 2 distinct but connected entities, they were like, we love the project, but we don't control the lampposts. That's DOT. I was like, all right, no problem. So I called up DOT, and luckily we have a long-term relationship, and I had just met with them a few months ago, not because we had a project, but simply to keep continuing building our relationships. And so they were really, into it, and we're having conversations now with DOT. And let me tell you, the Parks Department was excited about it because they were like, look, they've got some plans that we would love. So when you're doing your negotiations, will you get that information out of DOT? So I'm now working, even though Parks had said to me, you can't do it, it's DOT. When I said, no problem, I'll go to them directly, they were like, oh, great. Can you help us out with this other thing with them too? So it's complicated, it's really messy. Sometimes you don't really know how you're gonna get it done, like putting that artwork in outer space. Or sometimes you do know, it's DOT, but the reality is when we touch those lampposts, the Parks Department painted them not long ago. They wanna make sure their paint doesn't chip. the street is closed between certain hours. You know, there's so many different variables that one has to contend with. When we are dealing with Spencer Finch's ice cream truck, I'm dealing with the Department of Health, because this has got to be actually like a restaurant we're opening, so we have to get it up to code. So yeah, my day-to-day, there are 5 departments at Creative Time. There's the executive department, the executive team, if you will, the director, deputy director, and director of operations. There's our marketing and communications department, deals with all of the press and collateral. There's the development department that deals with fundraising. There's the global department, which is the Creative Time Summit, and Creative Time Reports, which are 2 distinct entities, but they are connected in that one department. And then there's my department, which is the programming department. So coming out of a museum, we're essentially the curatorial department, the exhibition design department, the education department, the visitor services and site staff and public engagement, and the community organizing. So if you wrap all of that together into 5 people, that's what you wind up with, those people who are dealing with the artists, dealing with the public space, dealing with the site, and negotiating that complicated territory. I don't know if that, I mean, I could go on about logistics all day, because frankly, that's. Yes and no. I mean, it was a positive that I had the knowledge or ability to go back to DOT, but yeah, every project is something new. We're working with the artist Phil Collins on a project that he wants to realize in prison. We've spent the last 3 years trying to build up relationships, learn the language. The thing that repeats is having a staff and being open and knowledgeable to, one, that you're not an expert into the field you're going into, so that you need to actually partner with and communicate with the experts, because there's always a new language to learn. Going into prison, I mean, first of all, just how you refer to prison or inmate, whether or not you call them an inmate, a prisoner, or someone on the inside, has implications for how you're positioning yourself. And so we are very deeply sensitive to how to continue to work with people and understand when we aren't the experts moving into a field, how to build those partnerships. So sometimes the knowledge applies, but most of the time you feel like you can write a book of like the ridiculous things you've done for art that you'll never get to use again. We do definitely reinvent the wheel. I have gotten to a point where I can like look at a project and get a sense of a budget, even if I don't know what it literally means. Just yet, I have a sense of that scale. But yeah, sometimes it's surprising, like we don't have the space, because we literally don't have a gallery. Like a lot of museums might actually physically have space, but we just have our one office, which is overflowing with people. So we don't even get to store our materials from the last project. So we often just sell them off or get rid of them, except we've been working with one brilliant installer for many years who occasionally is like, don't sell that, you're gonna want that again. And you're like, well, when am I ever gonna use life jackets again? Well, I can tell you, I need those life jackets for my next project. And he was like, well, I've got 7 of them that you guys told me you were never gonna use again after the Lawrence Weiner painting in the river. So some of the materials literally come back to you, but if you're lucky, but for us, there's not even one way that we realize a project. People ask a lot, how do you get to your project? And I think there's a few different ways. Sometimes artists come to us with a full vision, the way Paul Chan did, knowing he wanted to realize Waiting for Godot in New Orleans. And then it was about figuring out the site and figuring out how that was going to work. Sometimes a site comes to you, like Central Park or MTA Arts for Transit with Grand Central, and then it's about citing the artist there. And occasionally it's been these group shows as well, which is a different concept altogether, commissioning in the context of group shows. And there's a lot of exhibitions I didn't speak to, like Plot 09 on Governor's Island and other Livingness Forum and other major exhibitions that have been done by the organization. So there's not even one direct way that we realize our work. The reality is what we keep consistent is adhering to our mission. I mean, it sounds silly, but we go back to that all the time. Are we providing opportunity for artists? Are we being, helping to shift the dialogue? Are we contributing to our community? And then we ask a lot of questions each time with each project that are more about fundamental issues we're addressing rather than just those logistics. Because at the end of the day, you can just hire myself, my team, or an outside person if we need like a logistics master. We can figure that out. But are we able? What's the vision of the project? Do we believe in it? And how are we gonna do that? Oh, so that space was bought before we moved into it. Nobody had public access to it. It was bought by Chad Valentis of Two Trees. They actually had always planned to tear down that building. That was the original place where they would store sugar. And they did save a lot of those materials, but we knew when that was getting torn down from the beginning. So it was serendipitous that it was literally our board chair. It was an opportunity that we couldn't pass up despite any reservations. And so it was literally because of a site visit that he opened up the space for a few of us one day, and we just begged him and he was open to it. And they did do a lot. They're also very well known for working with artists and being supportive, give a lot of space to artists in Dumbo, et cetera. So they were doing like community garden spaces across the street in another space. No other major exhibition was done in that site though. It was only our show. But yeah, it was because that was purchased property and then we had access to it for a finite period of time. There were other artists that we spoke to as well. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But it was really clear that was just a powerful space for her and her ideas, and it was very clear very quickly. So we did invite a few other artists, and it can, you never know and it didn't turn out to be as generative for other artists. There was a moment where we thought maybe we could have this for a long period of time and do several artist exhibitions. Turned out not to be the case because once we realized the scale of production on Cara's show and what we could do, and we knew the finite closing date, it wasn't going to be a possibility. But we did actually consider a few artists. We also considered a few artists for Grand Central as well when we were approached about that space. And I should say Central Park, I've had so many dialogues happening. It's really hard to know when you're working and commissioning work what's actually going to happen. So we have 8 artists in the show, but I certainly had more than 8 conversations happening. I don't feel that I'm the artist. I work very closely with artists. I think that the work that I'm doing as a curator and the director of the team is about a collaboration. So the online, though the term curator has really been adopted and sort of fetishized recently in mass culture, the work that I'm doing is not about just picking and choosing. Certainly the work that curators and museums are doing is not also about picking and choosing, but even more overtly what I'm doing, while I might have invited conversations with, and picked and chosen artists to invite into dialogue, it's an intense collaboration where you're dealing with all those restrictions that you asked about that come with public space, and also how is the public going to engage in a project, and we think that through. So I don't think of myself though as an artist on any project, but as a supporter, a collaborator, someone who really enables the artist to realize their dream. So yeah, I suppose sometimes there are fine lines, but what we do is a really supportive practice where we try to do whatever it takes to realize whatever crazy thing someone wants to do. We put a lot of thought into it. We actually, so there's foam underneath of the Sphinx. The majority of that architecture was actually foam. There was a few inches of sugar on top, but we actually had all that foam recycled back to the original company that we purchased it from. They were willing to take it back and recycle it into theirs. But in order to do that, we actually had to strip the sugar off the outside. So we did a major cleaning process to do that. The sugar sculptures just became Cara's property, and the resin as well those were covered in sugar. But I think the most amount of sugar you're probably talking about was on the Sphinx itself, and we essentially recycled the inside of it. The outside, there's not much you could. First, you had to cut it apart to do that, to clean it off, and there's not much you can't serve that to people in coffee. We always talk with the artists about whether or not we do a talk, public conversation, which we tend to do, actually. Almost every single work has resulted in that. In fact, Trevor Paglin, when we put that artwork into outer space, it was a really big issue for us, was, well, how is the public going to experience this? Because no one's going into the geosynchronous orbit. So we ended up doing this free public conversation in Bryant Park with Werner Herzog and Trevor Paglin. Several thousand people came out that night. We set up a major event. So we do a lot of public conversation. We've also moved away from a volunteer-based system to hired site staff. So this is a good opportunity for me to plug that, because we are going to be hiring people for Central Park. We did it for Black Radical Brooklyn, and we're going to do it again for Central Park. And for me, it's really important as we build up. Creative Time doesn't have an education department. As I said, it sort of it falls within my department, and it's something that I'm trying to build, is how we communicate and deal with the public, being able to speak through the exhibitions, the site, our partners. I mean, such layered content out there. So we've begun actually hiring our team so that we can train them and bring them into the fold on that. So if any of you are interested, you should certainly just get in touch, because we are going to be hiring staff for Central Park. So that's one way too that we've been doing it, because bringing on over 100-something volunteers, while amazing, and each one of them does go through a training, and it's not so much that the training changes anymore, because we actually did actively do trainings and then check-ins with the volunteers to see what kinds of questions they were asked, any issues that would come up. The only difference is that we hope that, well, two things. One, with the opportunity to pay people, as with our paid internships, it's something the organization believes in. But two, that I hope that there's a little more consistency too, so that people really also take ownership of these projects and their role in it as well. So it's something that we're committed to organizationally and trying to continue to build upon. No. It was inside of the factory. Now, if you think about that factory, that used to store, in fact, can I go back to it? This was the storage for sugar. It would have, for the whole factory, it would have gone as high, not quite as high as the Sphinx, but you see that, I can finally use that little pointer, This thing right here, I'm blanking on the name of that, like the column. The sugar was actually piled high on that because this was the storage place. It would have been this whole room would have been piled up with sugar. So we did bring down Dominos, what do you call it, exterminator, to check out the site. And he was like, you have a minor ant problem, some pigeons. They did have some raccoons at some point, but those had been gotten rid of before we ever got there. So in fact, the amount of sugar that we were contributing to the space was kind of negligible, and the amount that was actually being processed by that when it was in fact a plant. And so everyone was like, how come you didn't have rats? I'm like, I don't know, why didn't they have rats before? Nobody knows why they didn't have rats, but we were really grateful that we did not have rats. But yeah, those are sort of the things I don't speak to it, but we bring in the exterminator. That's part of the art conversation as well, so yeah. All right, well, thank you guys. I really appreciate it. Thank you.